Chapter 1. The market in Dubrovica was alive with its usual Saturday bustle when Gideon saw her for the first time. She stood behind a stall where herbs were spread across a worn strip of canvas, bundles of St. John's wort, bunches of dried lavender, small clay jars filled with salves, and she was haggling with a customer with such an open, infectious smile that any casual observer would have taken her for an ordinary village herbalist. Gideon was no casual observer. He had been standing in the shadow of the neighboring shop's awning for nearly 15 minutes, studying her movements with the trained attention of a man taught to recognize the signs of witchcraft beneath any disguise. The small details betrayed her one after another. The way the flowers in her basket wilted and then revived for no apparent reason. The way she avoided direct sunlight, preferring the shade of the awning. The way the local dogs, normally indifferent to passers-by, gave her stall a wide berth with their tails tucked low. A witch. He was as certain of it as a hunter with 15 years of service to the Order of Ash could possibly be. Gideon waited until the last customer had stepped away from the stall before moving forward. His hand settled instinctively on the hilt of the consecrated blade at his belt. "By authority of the Crown and the Order of Ash," he said, stopping in front of her, "you are accused of practicing witchcraft. Do not resist, and the interrogation will be over more quickly." The young woman looked up at him. Her eyes were dark green, too vivid for an ordinary mortal, framed by lashes as black as pitch. Instead of the fear he had expected, her face showed something far more irritating. Amusement. "Interrogation?" she repeated, tilting her head. "What an interesting way to introduce yourself, Hunter. Usually a man gives me his name before demanding that I spend the evening with him." "Don't play innocent with me," Gideon said through clenched teeth, taking a step closer to block any attempt to retreat behind the stall. "I've seen enough to know the truth." "The truth about what?" She raised an eyebrow in exaggerated confusion, though her fingers were already sliding almost imperceptibly toward one of the clay jars on the table. "That I sell herbs more honestly than half the merchants in this market? Or that my flowers stay fresh longer because I take proper care of them, rather than relying on dark powers?" "The dogs are afraid of you," Gideon said, nodding toward the nearest animal, which was still watching the stall warily from a safe distance.
"That doesn't happen around ordinary herbalists."
The girl laughed, a short, bright laugh, as though his accusation amused her far more than it frightened her. "Maybe I just smell terrible to dogs," she suggested. "Or maybe you've spent too many years staring into shadows, looking for witches where there aren't any, Hunter. Perhaps now you see sorcery every time a stray dog sneezes." Gideon felt irritation rising inside him at her shameless, slippery chatter. Most witches, once exposed, either tried to flee or fought openly. This one simply stood there smiling at him with the same carefree insolence, as though the threat of arrest were no more serious than a badly told joke. "What's your name?" he demanded. "Morwen," she answered without hesitation. That surprised him. Most witches hid their true names behind false identities. "And you," she continued, "must have something appropriately grim and imposing, judging by the way you carry yourself. Gideon? Harold? Definitely something beginning with G." "Gideon," he said sharply, caught off guard by the accuracy of her guess. A second later, he was angry with himself for allowing her idle chatter to distract him. "Enough games. You're coming with me for questioning, willingly or by force." "By force?" Morwen tilted her head, her gaze traveling over his broad frame with openly provocative appraisal. "Considering the difference in our size, Hunter, by force doesn't sound like a particularly fair offer." "Magic against you," he countered. "That evens the odds more than you're pretending." "Fair point," she agreed with sudden disarming ease. "Then let's make a deal. You let me finish packing my things, and in return, I promise not to turn your boots into frogs right here in front of the entire market." Gideon opened his mouth to deliver a sharp reply to such insolence. At that exact moment, Morwen flung the contents of one of the clay jars straight at him. A cloud of fine silver powder exploded across his face, blinding him for a split second. Then she darted away from the stall with the agility of someone who had clearly spent years perfecting this exact kind of escape. "Stop!" Gideon shouted, rubbing his eyes with his sleeve as his vision returned with agonizing slowness. He charged after her, shoving past startled shoppers and following the flash of the blue scarf covering her dark hair as it moved through the crowd. But when he finally caught up with the figure near the entrance to a narrow alley, he found nothing but the same blue scarf draped over an empty clay jug, abandoned in the middle of the road as a mocking decoy. "Trickster," he growled under his breath. It was the first time he used the word for her, though he had no idea then how deeply that simple, angry description would become woven into everything that followed between them. He turned, scanning the alley for any sign of the direction she had truly taken. But Morwen had vanished as skillfully as she had appeared, dissolving into the market day crowd and leaving behind only the scent of spilled lavender and the wounded, simmering pride of a hunter who, for the first time in many years of service, had been fooled so completely by such a simple trick. Morwen did not allow herself to catch her breath until nearly half an hour later, when she had put enough distance between herself and the market square and found shelter in the shadow of an abandoned barn on the outskirts of Dubrovica. Her heart was still pounding from the excitement of the escape, but her lips curved involuntarily into a satisfied, triumphant smile when she remembered the expression of confused fury on the hunter's stern face after he discovered the empty jug. "Gideon," she repeated silently, testing the name in her mind with the same curiosity she might have given to some rare, unfamiliar plant. A handsome name for a man whose profession was hunting creatures like her. She brushed the road dust from her skirt and checked the contents of her battered satchel. Most of her goods had been abandoned at the market stall, but she had wisely hidden the most valuable ingredients in secret pockets before the hunter had even approached her. She had anticipated this outcome long before he took his first step in her direction. 5 years of wandering had taught her always to be ready to run. Her thoughts turned to Helga, waiting in a safe hiding place 3 days' journey away. The old mentor was undoubtedly already worried that Morwen had been gone longer than planned. And word of what had happened in Dubrovica meant they would have to change their route, leave the familiar roads behind, and avoid any places where hunters of the Order were likely to increase their patrols after today's failure. Still, Morwen thought, unable to suppress another smile as she remembered Gideon's disbelieving, furious expression at the moment of her escape. It was worth it just to see that look on an Order hunter's face. She had no idea how soon fate would bring them together again, or how tightly their paths would become intertwined before one brief, audacious deception in a crowded marketplace grew into something far more important to both of them than a chance encounter between a hunter and a witch. Chapter 2. 3 days after the failure in Dubrovica, Gideon stood before the Grand Master of the Order of Ash, expecting the reprimand he deserved for letting a witch escape. Instead, he received something far more unexpected. "You'll be seeing her again," Grandmaster Valon said. He was an elderly man with piercing eyes and deep lines carved into his face by decades of service to the Order. "And this time, it won't be to execute her." Gideon frowned, unable to understand the sudden change of direction. "Grandmaster?" "Sit," Valon ordered, gesturing toward the chair opposite his massive oak desk. "This is more complicated than an ordinary hunt, Gideon, and it concerns more than your professional duty." He unfolded a parchment scroll covered in tight handwriting across the desk, a report from one of the Order's spies who had been tracking the movements of the surviving members of the witch covens destroyed 5 years earlier. "Your sister," Balan said. At the mere mention of Lyra, Gideon felt something tighten inside him. "Her condition is deteriorating faster than the healers expected. The curse infecting her blood comes from the same source as the blight Morgana placed upon the royal family 20 years ago." "I know what caused her illness, Grandmaster," Gideon said, his voice sharper than he intended. "The healers explained that to me long ago. The only thing they haven't been able to explain is how to cure her." "Perhaps now they can," Velen replied, "thanks to information obtained from one of the witch agents we captured. There is an artifact known as the Heart of the Ashen Tree. It is capable of breaking curses of this kind. It lies within the ruined sanctuary of the old coven, the same one we destroyed 5 years ago." Hope and suspicion rose inside Gideon in equal measure. If the sanctuary was destroyed, why hasn't the Order recovered the artifact already? "Because the way inside is protected by magical traps that distinguish between human and witch blood," Velen explained. "An ordinary human wouldn't survive beyond the first chamber. We need a guide who knows the place and possesses enough magical power to bypass its defenses." "And you have such a guide," Gideon concluded, already anticipating an unpleasant turn in the conversation. "We do," Velen confirmed. "A young woman named Morwen, a survivor of that very coven, and according to our information, the only person who knows the exact route into the sanctuary." Gideon went still. The name struck him with immediate, sharp recognition. "The witch from Dubrovitsa," he said quietly. "The very same," Velen replied. "We captured her mentor, an old witch named Helga, 3 days ago in the neighboring province. Morwen will cooperate to save someone she cares about. Those are the terms I intend to offer her." "And you want me to escort her," Gideon said, feeling his irritation grow with every word. "Not merely escort her," Velen corrected. "Control her. The witch is clever and resourceful, judging by the report of your unsuccessful attempt to arrest her in Dubrovitsa. We need a hunter experienced enough to anticipate and prevent any attempt at betrayal or escape, while still ensuring that the expedition reaches the artifact." "Why me, Grandmaster?" Gideon asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Because your sister needs the cure, and your personal stake in the mission guarantees a level of commitment that a formal order given to another hunter would not," Velen said plainly. "Bring back the artifact, and Lyra receives treatment. Fail the mission, or allow the witch to escape, and I'm afraid the Order's assistance with your sister's condition may become far less of a priority among our many urgent concerns." The words were an unmistakable threat, disguised as a practical proposition. Gideon felt anger at the blackmail, battling with the knowledge that he had no real choice. "I accept," he said at last through clenched teeth. "When do I meet the witch?" "Tomorrow morning," Villan replied. "She has already been brought to the fortress dungeons for a preliminary discussion of the terms. I'm sure your reunion will be enlightening, considering your previous encounter." Morwen sat in a cramped stone cell with her arms folded across her chest, studying the rough walls with the same bored expression she might have worn while inspecting a poorly arranged market stall. The cell door creaked open. She looked up, expecting yet another guard carrying a bowl of tasteless stew. Instead, she found a familiar, stern figure standing in the doorway, his expression one of extreme and barely contained irritation. "Gideon," she drawled with exaggerated delight, straightening on the rough wooden bench. "What an unpleasant surprise. Have you come to apologize for ruining my merchandise at the market? You should know that jar of salve cost considerably more than you might imagine." "Stop playing the fool," he said through clenched teeth as he stepped into the cell and shut the door behind him with a loud metallic clang that echoed off the stone walls. "Grandmaster Villan explained the terms to you?" "He did," Morwen confirmed. Her tone became noticeably more serious now that the real matter had been raised. "I lead you, a hunter of the Order, into the heart of my coven's ruined sanctuary in exchange for Helga's life. A charming proposal, considering your order is the reason the sanctuary is in ruins in the first place, and that you slaughtered nearly everyone I cared about 5 years ago. Gideon felt an unexpected stab of something that resembled guilt. He suppressed it quickly, reminding himself why he was here. You have a choice, he said. Refuse the deal and let Helga die, or cooperate and save at least one life from your destroyed coven. What a compelling choice, Morwen replied sarcastically, between sacrificing someone I love and betraying my own principles. Your order has a remarkable talent for creating dilemmas like that, Hunter. I don't have a choice in this either, Gideon said, more sharply than he intended. My sister is dying from the same curse. There's an artifact in that sanctuary that may be able to cure her. The Grandmaster promised the Order's help if this mission succeeds. Morwen fell silent for a moment. She studied his face with new, more careful attention, as if trying to judge whether the confession was genuine. So we're both hostages to circumstance, she said at last, her tone softening almost imperceptibly. How inconveniently touching. Do you accept the terms or not? Gideon asked, unwilling to prolong the conversation any further than necessary. I accept, Morwen said, rising from the bench with exaggerated grace. But I'll warn you now, Hunter. Forced cooperation isn't going to create trust between us. I'll guide you to the sanctuary. I'll fulfill my side of the bargain for Helga. But don't expect obedience from me simply because I've been coerced into this. The last thing I need is your obedience, Gideon snapped. I need the route to the artifact, and your word that you won't attempt to escape or betray me along the way. My word? Morwen arched an eyebrow with obvious irony. The word of a witch doesn't sound like particularly reliable currency to a hunter of the order, does it? Then name the terms that would convince me you mean what you say, Gideon demanded. Morwen considered that for a moment. Her eyes flashed with the same mischievous amusement he had seen in the marketplace 3 days earlier. A magical vow, she suggested at last. A witch's oath that binds my own power to the terms of our agreement. If I break my promise, my magic turns against me. Reliable enough even for the most suspicious hunter? Gideon studied her for a long moment, weighing the sincerity of the offer. Finally, he gave a reluctant nod. Acceptable, he said. We leave at dawn tomorrow. Gather whatever you need for a long journey. As you command, Hunter, Morwen replied with a playful, exaggerated bow. But the look she gave him as he left the cell was far more serious and calculating than her earlier carefree bravado would have suggested. A long road ahead, she thought when she was alone once more in the cramped cell. A long, difficult road beside a man whose profession is killing people like me. Chapter 3. The first day of the journey passed in an atmosphere of tense, hostile silence, broken only occasionally by Gideon's short, clipped remarks about their route. Morwen, riding a calm mare beside his large warhorse, had far less patience for the silence than her escort expected. You know, Hunter, she said as the sun began climbing toward midday. Brooding silence may impress strangers at first, but I find that kind of monotony gets boring very quickly. Your boredom is the least of my concerns, Gideon replied, without taking his eyes off the forest road ahead. That's a mistake, Morwen said. A bored witch is a dangerous witch, Hunter. An idle mind finds its own entertainment when none is offered willingly. Less than an hour later, Gideon discovered just how accurate that warning had been. The water in his travel flask had suddenly acquired a distinct taste of lemon, even though he was absolutely certain he had filled it with ordinary, clean stream water. What did you do? He demanded, choking slightly on the unexpected sourness. Nothing important, Morwen replied innocently, though the corners of her mouth twitched with barely suppressed amusement. Perhaps the water in this region is naturally acidic. Stop using magic without permission, Gideon said sharply, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. The terms of our agreement did not include amusing yourself at my expense. The terms of our agreement required me to guide you to the sanctuary, Morwen countered with exaggerated seriousness. Nothing was said about forbidding small, harmless jokes along the way. Gideon clenched his jaw, feeling his irritation grow with every minute of their forced companionship. But common sense told him that openly confronting her would only give her more reasons to provoke him. By evening, when they stopped for the night at a small roadside inn, the situation became considerably more complicated than a few minor magical pranks. "We have only one room left," the innkeeper told them apologetically. "The other guests took all the separate rooms before you arrived. I can only offer you one with a single large bed, assuming, of course, that you are husband and wife, as I guessed from your arriving together." "We are not married," Gideon said quickly. "What a shame," Morwen sighed theatrically, before he could offer any further explanation. "We are married, actually, good sir. My husband is simply shy about showing affection in public. Military discipline, you understand. He's grown accustomed to hiding tender emotions behind a stern expression." Gideon shot her a look of open outrage. The innkeeper, apparently missing the sarcasm entirely, merely nodded in understanding before leading them upstairs to the only available room. "Why did you do that?" Gideon hissed as soon as the innkeeper was out of earshot. "Would you really rather sleep in the stable with the horses, just to avoid the terrible hardship of sharing a roof with me?" Morwen asked, blinking at him with wicked amusement. Gideon said nothing. Reluctantly, he had to admit there was logic in her reasoning, though the thought of spending the night in the same room as a witch whose cunning he had already experienced more than once that day did little to please his disciplined nature. The room was modest but clean: a single bed, a narrow table beside the window, and a worn armchair in the corner clearly intended for the less fortunate of the two occupants. "The chair is yours," Morwen announced, tossing her travel bag onto the bed with the confidence of someone who had no intention of discussing alternative arrangements. "And why exactly do you get the bed?" Gideon demanded. "Because a lady is supposed to have the better sleeping arrangement," Morwen replied with exaggerated innocence. "Or have you forgotten the basic rules of chivalry after so many years of hunting harmless herbalists?" "You are not a lady," Gideon said through clenched teeth. "You are a witch and a potential threat, and I was ordered to keep you under constant watch." "Then that's an even better reason to leave me where you can see me," Morwen countered with a triumphant smile, "instead of letting me disappear into the darkness of the chair while you sleep comfortably in the bed." Gideon fought the urge to continue the pointless argument for several long moments, before finally surrendering to the undeniable, if infuriating, logic of her final point. He lowered himself into the chair with obvious displeasure. The night passed restlessly. Gideon slept only in brief intervals, remaining instinctively alert even in sleep and ready to wake at the slightest suspicious sound. Morwen, judging by her slow, even breathing, slept far more peacefully than the circumstances of their forced proximity should have allowed. In the morning, as pale dawn light began to filter through the curtained window, Gideon woke to a sudden sharp sting in his neck, as though some insect had bitten him. "What the—" He sprang from the chair, one hand flying to the painful spot. Morwen was already awake and dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed and watching his reaction with poorly concealed amusement. "Good morning, Hunter," she said cheerfully. "An excellent way to test whether your reflexes are still fast enough to react to danger when you've just woken up." "Did you sting me?" Gideon demanded, feeling around his neck for the source of the pain. "A small spell," Morwen admitted, without the slightest trace of remorse. "Nothing dangerous. Just a little sting to remind you of the importance of constant vigilance. I'm sure your own order would approve of that kind of reflex training." My order does not approve of unprovoked attacks by witches against hunters, who are supposed to be working with them, Gideon said through clenched teeth, his irritation rising all over again. We are not allies, Morwen corrected, rising from the bed with the same effortless grace that seemed to define all her movements. We are reluctant traveling companions with a temporary common goal. Don't confuse the two, Hunter, no matter how many nights we end up spending under the same roof. Gideon said nothing. He rubbed his sore neck and watched her gather her few belongings with the same carefree confidence she had shown in everything she did since their first encounter in the Dubrovitsa market. Trickster, he thought darkly, remembering the word he had first used for her during that humiliating chase. The description seemed more appropriate with every hour they spent together, gaining new weight and justification as her sly, untamable nature revealed itself again and again. How much longer are we supposed to endure each other's company? He asked aloud as he followed her down the inn's narrow staircase. As long as it takes to reach the sanctuary, Morwen replied over her shoulder. Judging by the map you so kindly displayed last night without noticing me looking over your shoulder, about a week, assuming the weather cooperates. Gideon groaned inwardly at the thought of another week filled with provocations and petty tricks. But common sense reminded him that complaining about the terms of the mission, the only hope he had of saving his sister, would be both pointless and dangerously short-sighted. What he did not yet realize was how profoundly that forced week together would change not only his understanding of witches, but also his own deeply rooted beliefs about the line between an enemy and someone whose company, against all logic and professional caution, was beginning to feel less like a punishment and more like something unexpectedly vivid and alive. Something unpredictable. Something filled with colors he had almost forgotten existed outside the disciplined grayness of his life as a hunter. Chapter 4. By the third day of their journey, the tense hostility between them had begun to give way to something more complicated, though neither of them was ready to admit the change aloud. They stopped in a small village called Heathervale to replenish their supplies before crossing the rougher country ahead. There, they found the villagers gathered in alarm around a house on the outskirts. "The boy has been burning with fever for 3 days," an anxious woman explained from among the worried neighbors. "The village healer can do nothing, and the nearest town is 2 days away. We're afraid he won't survive the night." Against his own expectations, Gideon felt a sudden pang of sympathy at the sight of such desperation. But professional caution told him that delaying the mission for a stranger carried unnecessary risks. "We need to keep moving," he said quietly to Morwen, but she was already walking toward the sick child's house with a determination that left little room for argument. "Morwen," Gideon called in warning. "1 hour, Hunter," she said over her shoulder. "Or would you rather let an innocent child die while we rush toward a destination that can wait a little longer?" Despite his irritation at the unplanned delay, Gideon followed her inside the modest village home and watched as she bent over the bed of a pale, feverish boy of about 7. An ordinary fever, Morwen concluded after a brief examination, made worse by the wrong treatment. Your local healer seems to have confused his herbs. She took several bundles of dried plants from her satchel and mixed them quickly and confidently in a clay bowl with hot water brought by the boy's frightened mother. "This isn't witchcraft," she explained, noticing Gideon's wary stare as he watched her with a hunter's professional suspicion. "Any skilled herbalist could do the same with the right knowledge. There's no magic involved, only knowing the proper proportions." She helped the boy drink the bitter infusion. Within 15 minutes, his breathing had become noticeably steadier, and the burning heat of his fever was already beginning to ease beneath the relieved eyes of his parents. "Thank you," his mother whispered, pressing her hands to her chest. "We'll never be able to repay you, my lady." "There's nothing to repay," Morwen said with genuine warmth, a striking contrast to her usual teasing bravado. Make sure he drinks plenty of water for the next 2 days, and the fever should pass completely. Several hours later, as they rode away from the village and resumed their journey toward the distant sanctuary, Gideon remained silent for a long time, turning over what he had witnessed. "You could have lied about what you did," he said at last. "Claimed it was magical healing. Impressed a village full of superstitious people." "I could have," Morwen agreed. "But sometimes the truth is more useful than an impressive lie, Hunter. Besides," a trace of her old mischievous smile returned, "ordinary knowledge of herbs frightens people considerably less than open magic. Fewer frightened cries of witch mean fewer people chasing me down the road." Gideon nodded, acknowledging the practical wisdom in her reasoning. But something more complicated than simple approval had begun to take root inside him, a reluctant, growing respect for someone capable of genuine kindness, even in the middle of a dangerous journey she had never chosen to make. The incident that drew them even closer came that same evening, after they made camp at the edge of a dense forest and lit a modest fire to prepare their meager supper. Gideon was dressing a rabbit they had caught the previous day when he noticed Morwen, seated nearby sorting another collection of herbs, suddenly go still. Her gaze had fixed on something in the bushes beyond their camp. "What is it?" he asked, instinctively reaching for his weapon. "An injured animal," she said softly, getting to her feet and moving toward the faint, miserable whimpering. "A fox cub by the sound of it." She found a young fox with one paw trapped in an old, rusted iron trap, apparently abandoned months ago by some careless hunter. The animal trembled with pain and fear, its eyes wild with desperate terror as the humans approached. "Careful," Gideon warned. "Wounded animals are unpredictable, especially wild ones." But Morwen was already kneeling beside the trapped fox. Her voice softened into a low, soothing whisper as she began murmuring something in a language Gideon did not recognize. It did not sound like a spell in the usual sense. It was closer to something between a lullaby and a prayer. Despite its instinctive fear, the fox gradually grew still beneath the sound of her voice, allowing Morwen to carefully but firmly free its injured paw from the rusted jaws of the trap. "The bone isn't broken," she said after a quick examination, "but the wound needs to be wrapped, and it needs rest before it can return to the forest on its own." She treated the injury with the remaining herbs in her bag, wrapped the paw in a strip of clean cloth torn from the hem of her own underskirt, and settled the trembling fox into a warm nest of dry leaves near their fire. Gideon watched in thoughtful silence. The old, deeply rooted belief he had carried about witches being ruthless and selfish was cracking once again, more visibly this time, under the weight of kindness motivated by nothing except simple compassion. "Why do you do it?" he asked when she returned to the fire and sat across from him, looking tired but satisfied. "Do what?" Morwen asked. "Help a stranger's sick child. Save an injured fox. Spend your time and strength on creatures that can give you nothing in return." Morwen studied him for a long moment before answering with a seriousness he had rarely heard from her. "Because my coven taught me that magic was not a weapon for power or revenge," she said quietly. "It was a gift. And gifts like that carry a responsibility to protect those weaker than yourself. Helga always used to say that power without compassion becomes a curse instead of a blessing." "Your coven," Gideon repeated. It was the first time since they had met that she had spoken openly about her former life without hiding behind sarcasm. "My coven," Morwen confirmed. For a moment, her eyes clouded with old, deeply buried pain. "The same coven your Order of Ash destroyed 5 years ago, if you're interested in the complete version of my life story, Hunter." Gideon fell silent. The confession weighed heavily on him. It was a direct reminder that people of his profession, perhaps even men who had stood beside him in the Order, were responsible for the tragedy that had shaped the life of the woman now sitting across the fire from him. "I'm sorry," he said at last. The words sounded awkward coming from him, unfamiliar on the tongue of a man who rarely offered apologies. "Don't apologize for something you didn't personally do," Morwen replied, though her voice softened at the sincerity of his sympathy. "But thank you for at least acknowledging what your order did instead of blindly justifying everything in the name of some higher duty." They sat in silence for a long time afterward, both absorbed in the unfamiliar intimacy of having revealed something real to one another. Eventually, Gideon broke the silence with a question that had been troubling his curiosity for some time. "Tell me about Helga," he said. "What is she like?" Morwen smiled. For the first time that evening, it was a genuinely warm smile, untouched by defensive irony. "Strict but fair," she said. "She taught me herbalism when I was 5 and magic when I was 7. After the massacre, she was the only surviving mentor I had left from my entire coven. To lose her now..." Her voice trailed off. She did not finish the sentence, but Gideon saw enough in her eyes to understand the depth of the fear she could not bring herself to put into words. "We'll get her back," he said quietly, surprising himself with the certainty in his own voice. "I swear it, Morwen. We'll fulfill the terms of the bargain, and Helga will be free." She looked at him for a long moment, studying his face as though trying to determine whether such an unexpected promise could truly be sincere, coming from a man whose profession had once represented nothing to her but hostility and destruction. "Thank you, Gideon," she said softly. It was the first time she had spoken his name without even a trace of mockery. Night settled over their small camp in quiet stillness. As they fell asleep on opposite sides of the dying fire, both of them could feel that the old wall of open hostility between them had begun to crack. The fractures were still small, but unmistakably real, promising something far more complicated and far richer than the simple opposition of hunter and witch. Chapter 5. The road to the sanctuary grew wilder and more difficult with every passing day. Dense forests gave way to rocky foothills, while familiar trade roads gradually disappeared into barely visible animal trails. "There's a river ahead," Morwen said, studying the worn map she had pulled from her travel bag. "According to this route, the only ford is a good 5 miles north. That would add an entire day to the journey." "Or we could cross here," Gideon countered, assessing the width and depth of the rushing water with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to such challenges in the field. "By we, I assume you mean you, with your impressive muscles and natural abundance of confidence," Morwen remarked with her usual irony, though genuine unease entered her voice as she looked at the violent current. "Some of us would rather not risk drowning just to save a little time." "I'll help you across," Gideon said, dismounting and leading his horse closer to the bank. "The river isn't as deep as it looks. You can see the stones on the bottom." Morwen hesitated for a long moment, staring at the churning water with obvious distrust, before reluctantly nodding and dismounting as well. "If I drown, Hunter," she warned with mock seriousness, "my ghost will haunt you for the rest of your life. Nothing dramatic, just an endless series of small but extremely irritating misfortunes." "I'll do my best to prevent that outcome," Gideon replied with the faintest hint of a rare smile as he took her hand in a firm, steady grip. The crossing proved more difficult than Gideon's initial optimistic assessment had suggested. The current was far stronger than it had appeared from the bank, and the slippery stones beneath their feet threatened to send them sprawling with every step. Despite all her earlier bravado, Morwen clung to Gideon's hand with genuine, undisguised panic when a sudden surge of water nearly knocked her off balance in the deepest part of the river. "Hold on," Gideon said, pulling her closer and wrapping his free arm around her waist for support. We're almost there." Despite her instinctive desire to maintain the distance she had always kept between them, Morwen pressed closer to him. There was something unexpectedly reassuring about the solid strength of his body, shielding her from the force of the rushing water. They finally stumbled onto the opposite bank, soaked to the bone and breathing hard from the strain, but unharmed. Only once her feet were firmly on dry ground did Morwen realize that she had remained in his arms noticeably longer than necessary, simply to keep her balance. "Thank you," she said, quickly stepping away. Her cheeks had turned pink, whether from the cold water or something else she was not yet prepared to define, even to herself. "You're welcome," Gideon replied, wringing water from his soaked cloak with his usual unreadable expression. Still, his gaze lingered on her drenched figure a little longer than it should have. That evening, after making camp on the far side of the river, they spread their wet clothes near the fire to dry and settled into a silence that had once felt uncomfortable, but was slowly becoming something closer to companionship. "You know, Hunter," Morwen said, breaking the quiet with her usual teasing tone, though the sharpness behind it had softened considerably. "For a man whose profession involves exterminating witches, you display remarkably gentlemanly manners when it comes to saving one from drowning." "Professional duty doesn't eliminate basic human decency," Gideon replied, sounding more thoughtful than defensive. "An impressively progressive opinion for someone raised by the order," she said with a small smile. "I suppose I should find a suitable nickname for you, considering Trickster seems to have become my official title thanks to you." "And what nickname did you have in mind?" Gideon asked with wary curiosity. Morwen looked him over thoughtfully, as though weighing several possibilities with exaggerated seriousness. "Righteous One," she announced at last with a triumphant smile. "It suits your unwavering devotion to duty and morality, even while being forced to cooperate with a representative of the supposedly cursed witching kind." "Righteous One," Gideon repeated with obvious displeasure. "That sounds like mockery." "Of course it's mockery," Morwen said cheerfully. "But respectful mockery, I assure you. Not many men in your profession manage to hold on to their principles when circumstances offer much easier and far less honorable alternatives." Gideon remained silent for a while, considering the unexpected compliment hidden beneath her familiar, light-hearted sarcasm. "Ash Saint wouldn't be bad either," Morwen added, mischief sparkling in her eyes. "Considering the Order of Ash and your general dedication to lofty moral standards." "We'll stick with Righteous One," Gideon said, the faintest smile touching his lips. For the first time since their journey began, he accepted her teasing nickname without his usual irritation. Morwen laughed. It was a genuine, warm laugh, strikingly different from the sharp, defensive humor she had once used as a shield. Watching her in the firelight, Gideon felt something new stirring in his chest, something unsettling, something he refused, for now, to name. But whatever it was, it had already moved far beyond simple professional tolerance of an unwanted companion. As the night deepened, their conversation became far more serious than the playful exchange of nicknames had suggested. "Tell me about your sister," Morwen said, settling more comfortably beside the fire. Her expression had grown serious, stripped of its usual teasing edge. "What is Lyra like?" Gideon was silent for a long time before answering. The subject touched feelings too personal and too deeply buried for a man accustomed to keeping them carefully contained. "Kind," he said at last. "Far kinder than I am. She always found joy in little things, wildflowers, birdsong, ridiculous jokes I never learned to appreciate enough." He paused. "The curse struck her 3 years ago. Since then, it's been slowly draining her strength, taking away her ability to move freely the way she once did." "I'm sorry," Morwen said quietly. There was no sarcasm in her voice now, only open and genuine compassion. No one deserves to fade away like that. Slowly, painfully. That's why I agreed to this mission, Gideon continued. Regardless of everything I once believed about witches and their magic, for even a chance to give her life back, I would sacrifice far more than being forced to work with. He hesitated, unable to find the right word. A witch? Morwen offered with a faint but good-natured smile. With someone whose help has proven far more valuable and far more sincere than I expected, Gideon corrected. His eyes met hers across the fire with a new and unfamiliar directness. Morwen felt her heart skip a beat at the unexpected, disarming admission. For a moment, neither of them moved. Only the soft crackle of the embers disturbed the silence, as though both had realized at the same time just how far they had come from that first openly hostile confrontation in the Dubrovitsa marketplace. We should get some rest, Morwen said at last, quickly looking away. She suddenly felt the need to put some distance between them before the growing, unsettling attraction became even harder to ignore. Tomorrow promises to be no easier than the days before it. Good night, Morwen, Gideon said quietly. For the first time, he used her real name instead of his familiar trickster, and there was a new warmth in his voice when he spoke it. Good night, righteous one, she replied, allowing herself a small, warm smile before settling down to sleep on the opposite side of their modest camp. Both of them lay awake with thoughts filled by unfamiliar feelings, wondering how their reluctant partnership had changed so much over the days they had spent traveling together. Chapter 6. By the end of the 6th day, the landscape around them had changed completely. Dense forests had given way to harsh, rocky foothills, carved with deep ravines, and scattered with the remains of ancient, half-collapsed structures, evidence of the witch community that had once flourished there. We're close, Morwen said, bringing her mare to a halt before another bend in the narrow mountain trail. Her gaze was fixed on the distance, where the faint outlines of ruined towers rose against the darkening sky. The sanctuary is there, beyond the next ridge. Gideon felt tension tighten inside him as the goal of their long journey finally took on real, tangible form. What kind of defenses protect the sanctuary? He asked, automatically surveying the terrain with the trained eye of a hunter preparing for unknown dangers. Several kinds, Morwen replied, her expression growing unusually serious. Magical traps that distinguish between human and witch blood, as I told you before. But there are also protective spells placed by the founders of the coven generations ago. Trials that demand more than physical strength. They test a person's true character. What kind of trials? Gideon asked. I don't know exactly, Morwen admitted. I've never gone beyond the outer halls of the sanctuary on my own. Helga always accompanied me on journeys like this. She knows far more about the inner defenses than I do. Gideon felt another stab of unease at the scale of the uncertainty waiting ahead, but it was far too late to turn back, not only because of his oath to the Order, but because Lyra's fate depended on the success of this mission. We'll camp here tonight, he decided, indicating a narrow hollow near the trail that offered some protection from the wind. We enter the sanctuary at dawn, after we've had a full night's rest. The first magical trap revealed itself before they even reached the sanctuary. Near the ruined gates, the narrow trail appeared to continue normally, until the ground suddenly dropped away beneath Gideon's next step, the deadly cliff hidden by an expertly crafted illusion. Walking ahead, Gideon barely managed to stop at the very edge when he felt the earth shift beneath his boot. Stop! Morwen shouted. She grabbed his arm and pulled him backward before he could completely lose his balance. An illusion, Gideon said, breathing hard as he stared at the deceptively solid stretch of trail concealing the deadly drop. The first test, Morwen confirmed, still gripping his arm tightly. Witch spells don't only recognize blood, They test whether a traveler is paying attention. Careless visitors aren't considered worthy of reaching the sanctuary's treasures. She murmured a short spell and swept her free hand over the false path. The illusion dissolved. In its place appeared the true route, a narrow but stable stone bridge crossing the real chasm several yards away from where the false trail had seemed to lead. "Stay close to me," she said, finally releasing his arm. "The next traps may be much harder for human eyes to detect without magical guidance." Gideon nodded and followed her across the narrow bridge with a new and unfamiliar caution. For the first time, he fully understood just how dependent his own survival had become on the magical abilities of the woman he had intended to arrest and delivered to the order for interrogation barely a week earlier. The inner halls of the ruined sanctuary greeted them with oppressive silence, broken only by the echo of their careful footsteps among the remains of what had once been magnificent architecture. Carved columns covered in ancient runes still supported fragments of the high ceiling, though much of it had collapsed under the weight of time and the destruction wrought 5 years earlier. Dust and abandonment lay everywhere. Morwen moved through the ruins with unmistakable grief in her eyes, as though every broken stone awakened another painful memory of the life she had lost. "This used to be the main gathering hall," she said quietly, stopping before the remains of what had once been a grand altar. "I remember initiation ceremonies, solstice celebrations, even ordinary evenings when the entire coven would gather here to share stories and knowledge." Gideon watched the old sorrow touch her face and felt an unexpected weight of guilt over his own connection to the tragedy that had reduced this once living, meaningful place to ruins. "I truly am sorry," he said, "for what happened here. Whatever official justification the order may have given for actions like this." Morwen looked at him for a long moment before giving a small nod, silently but sincerely accepting the apology he had now offered more than once. Then the ground beneath them trembled. From the shadows between the ruined columns, ghostly, translucent figures began to emerge. Guardians of the sanctuary, awakened by ancient magic to protect the coven's deepest secrets from unworthy intruders. "Stay behind me," Morwen ordered. Her voice instantly became firm, all trace of melancholy gone as she focused on the approaching threat with a controlled professionalism Gideon had never before had the chance to witness fully. "What are they?" he asked, drawing his blade and taking up a defensive stance. "Guardian spirits," Morwen replied. "Spells given form to test the true intentions of those who enter. They're only truly dangerous to anyone who comes here with malicious purpose." She raised both hands and began speaking a rapid series of spells in an ancient language Gideon did not understand. A soft golden glow spread through the air around them. One by one, the spectral guardians struck against the light and dissolved, their ghostly forms scattering into nothing. Gideon watched the full extent of her magic with involuntary awe. The image he had once held of Morwen as a clever but relatively weak street witch collapsed completely in the face of such impressive, expertly controlled power. "You could have used that against me at any point during our journey," he said, when the last guardian vanished and silence returned to the ruined hall. "I could have," Morwen confirmed, breathing heavily from the effort of the spell. "But a promise is still a promise, Hunter. Even one made under pressure in exchange for the life of someone I love." Gideon looked at her with a level of respect far deeper than anything he had felt before. He understood now that the woman standing before him possessed not only a sharp tongue and a talent for irritating pranks, but genuine, formidable power. And the only thing restraining that power had never truly been his sword or the Order's threats. It was her own moral choice. "Let's keep moving," Morwen said, forcing herself past the exhaustion through sheer will. "The heart of the sanctuary lies deeper underground. in the chambers beneath this ruined temple. The path will only become more difficult from here. I can already feel the magical defenses growing stronger." They continued through the half-collapsed corridors, leaving the Hall of Guardians behind. Gideon followed her now with a new willingness to trust her judgment. And though Morwen would never have admitted it aloud, she felt an increasing sense of relief at having him beside her. A man whose strength and determination had once been directed against her, but now offered something solid and dependable in the most difficult journey of her life. Chapter 7. The underground halls beneath the ruined temple greeted them with absolute, impenetrable darkness, broken only by the faint magical light Morwen summoned with the small spell. It hovered above her open palm like an obedient, glowing moth. "The path grows more dangerous with every step," she warned, as she led Gideon through a narrow, winding corridor. Ancient runes covered the walls, glowing with a dim, ominous light whenever they drew near. "The final trial chamber lies ahead, just before the heart of the ashen tree itself." "What kind of trial?" Gideon asked, his hand settling instinctively on the hilt of his sword, though such a weapon would be of questionable use against magical defenses. "I don't know exactly," Morwen admitted. "But judging by how brightly the runes are glowing, the magic here is stronger than anything we've encountered so far." They entered a vast circular chamber, its ceiling disappearing into darkness high above them. The floor was covered in an intricate pattern of glowing runes, arranged into a complex, perfectly symmetrical mandala. "Stay along the edge," Morwen instructed, pointing to a narrow strip of bare stone running around the perimeter of the room. Stepping into the center of the pattern would activate the defensive spell at full strength. They began moving carefully along the safe path, but halfway across the chamber, Gideon was distracted by a sudden movement in the shadows at the far end of the room. His foot slipped. He stepped off the narrow strip of safe stone and directly into the center of the glowing pattern. The magical defenses reacted instantly and without mercy. The runes erupted in blinding crimson light, and an invisible force hurled Gideon backward, slamming him into the stone wall hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. He collapsed to the floor as sharp, tearing pain ripped through his body, spreading from his chest into every limb like poisonous fire. "Gideon!" Morwen cried, rushing toward him across the dangerous runes without a moment's hesitation. "Damn it," he rasped, looking down at his chest. Beneath the torn fabric of his shirt, a dark web of black veins was spreading outward from the point of impact like poisonous roots. "What is this?" "A blight curse," Morwen whispered. Her face went pale with horror as she watched the darkness spread. "An ancient spell designed to punish unworthy intruders who breach the sanctuary's defenses. It destroys a person's life force from within if it isn't stopped quickly." "How do we stop it?" Gideon asked, feeling the pain intensify with every passing second as breathing became increasingly difficult. Morwen remained silent for several moments. Her gaze moved between the spreading curse and her own trembling hands, as though she were weighing an impossible, desperate choice. "There is a way," she said at last, her voice shaking with barely restrained fear. "A direct transfer of magical energy through physical contact. I can channel my own power into you and neutralize the curse. But a ritual like that would drain a significant amount of my strength." "How significant?" Gideon asked, though the answer was already written on her face. "Possibly dangerous," she admitted quietly. "The curse is powerful. It may take nearly all of my magical energy to remove it completely." "No," Gideon said sharply, trying to push himself upright, despite the agony tearing through him. "Don't you dare risk yourself for me, Morwen. Find another way." "There is no other way," she argued, already dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands reached toward his chest with a determination that left no room for further debate. The curse will kill you within minutes if I don't intervene." "Then let it," Gideon said fiercely, pushing her hands away with fingers already weakening from the pain. "My life is not worth risking yours. Morwen, please, don't do this." "Be quiet, righteous one," she said with sudden, desperate firmness. She reached for him again, and this time refused to let him push her away. "I am not going to let you die here, no matter how noble and completely idiotic your objections are." "Morwen," he whispered, as strength rapidly drained from his body. "Please." But she had already pressed both palms against his chest, her eyes closed, her lips moving in a rapid, strained stream of ancient words, and Gideon felt warm, living energy begin to flow through her touch and into his body, fighting against the spreading darkness of the curse. The pain slowly began to fade. The black veins stopped their terrible advance. Then, agonizingly slowly, they began retreating toward the place where the curse had first struck him. But the cost of healing him became more obvious with every passing second. Morwen's face drained to a terrifying, deathly white. Her breathing became fast and uneven, breaking into shallow, convulsive gasps. Her entire body began to tremble from the rapidly worsening exhaustion. "Morwen, enough," Gideon pleaded. The curse had almost completely vanished now, but he could see how severely the effort was draining her already fading strength. "Stop. Please, that's enough." But she continued, her face twisted with unbearable strain until the final dark traces of the curse finally disappeared, leaving his body clean, healed, and free of the deadly magic. The instant the last trace vanished, Morwen collapsed forward. Her strength was completely gone. Her body went limp, about to fall unconscious onto the cold stone floor. Despite his own recent weakness, Gideon managed to catch her before she hit the ground, pulling her against his chest with desperate care. "Morwen," he whispered, staring down at her pale, unconscious face. "Morwen, please wake up." Several long, agonizing moments passed. Then her eyelids fluttered. Her dark green eyes opened slightly, unfocused but aware. "Gideon?" she whispered weakly. "The curse. Is it gone?" "It's gone," he confirmed. Relief and delayed overwhelming terror for her life crashed over him at once. "You saved me, Morwen. You nearly killed yourself doing it, even after I begged you not to." "I couldn't let you die," she whispered, a faint shadow of her old smile touching her lips. "Who else would call me trickster with that uniquely irritated tone of yours?" Something inside Gideon finally broke through the last remnants of his restraint. Relief, fear, gratitude, and something deeper, something he could no longer deny and no longer wanted to resist. He leaned down and kissed her, hard, desperate. He poured everything into that single touch, the panic of the past few minutes, the terror of losing her, the overwhelming gratitude for a life she had saved at the cost of nearly all her own strength. Morwen returned the kiss with weak but genuine tenderness, despite her exhaustion, feeling the attraction they had both suppressed for so long finally break free in a way neither of them could resist anymore. When Gideon finally pulled away, he wrapped his arms around her tightly, almost desperately, holding her against his chest with the same strength that had kept her from falling moments before. "Never do that again," he whispered fiercely against her ear, his voice trembling with emotion. "Do you hear me, Morwen? Never. I forbid you from risking your life for mine like that again." "You can't forbid me from doing anything, righteous one," she whispered weakly, though there was unmistakable warmth and amusement in her voice as she pressed closer to him, seeking comfort and warmth after the terrible exhaustion. "I'm a witch, in case you've forgotten, not some obedient companion who follows your orders." "Then," he said softly, pulling back just enough to look into her tired but still vivid eyes, "at least let me ask you." He paused. "Please, Morwen, Take care of yourself. For me, if not for yourself." She looked at him for a long moment, her dark green eyes shining with unshed tears of relief and emotions neither of them was trying to hide anymore. "I'll try," she whispered. "Gideon." They remained like that for a long time, holding each other in the middle of the ruined trial chamber, both shaken by the danger they had survived and by the sudden, disarming acknowledgement of feelings that neither old hostility nor professional caution could hide any longer behind teasing remarks and feigned indifference. Chapter 8. Morwen spent the rest of the night in a deep restorative sleep, while Gideon remained awake beside her, without closing his eyes even once, watching her breathing with the anxiety of a man who had, for the first time in his life, realized the true depth of his attachment to another person. He built a small fire in a relatively safe corner of the trial chamber, using the last of the firewood they had wisely brought from outside, and covered her with his own cloak, trying to soften the cold stone floor beneath her exhausted body. When dawn came, if such a thing could even be said to exist in underground halls without natural light, it was sensed more through an inner awareness of time than any visible change in illumination. At last, Morwen stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes that were still tired, but far clearer and more alert than they had been the night before. "How do you feel?" Gideon asked immediately, leaning closer with undisguised concern. "Weak," she admitted honestly, "but alive, which, considering what happened last night, is an achievement in itself." "You scared me to death," Gideon said quietly as he helped her sit up, supporting her shoulders with a tenderness that still felt unfamiliar to him. "I've never felt anything like that before, watching someone's life slipping away right in front of me." "I'm used to that kind of risk," Morwen tried to joke, though her voice was still faint. "Magic demands sacrifices, Hunter, no matter how inconvenient that may be for anxious traveling companions." "Morwen," he said seriously, taking her hands in his. "I said this last night, and I'll say it again. Don't ever risk yourself like that for me again. Do you understand? Your life is worth no less than mine, whatever you may think." She looked at him for a long moment, studying his face as though reassessing just how much had changed between them. "I'll try to remember that," she said at last, the shadow of her old smile touching her lips. "Though I won't promise complete obedience. Reckless decisions are rather deeply rooted in my nature." Gideon gave a short laugh. The sound was surprisingly light, coming from a man normally so restrained. He helped her to her feet, supporting her until she regained her balance after the terrible exhaustion of the previous night. "Can you keep going?" he asked with genuine concern. "The heart of the ashen tree is somewhere ahead, but if you need to rest—" "I can continue," Morwen assured him, though she leaned on his arm far more openly than she would have allowed herself to only a few days earlier, out of sheer stubbornness. "Any delay only prolongs Helga's suffering, and your sister's. Let's keep moving, righteous one." Their progress through the remaining underground chambers was considerably slower than before. Morwen was still recovering from the healing ritual, but with every chamber they crossed, the sanctuary's magical defenses seemed to soften, as though acknowledging their sincere intentions and the sacrifice already made as sufficient proof that their purpose was worthy. At last, they reached the deepest chamber. It was a vast circular room, and at its center stood something so otherworldly and beautiful that Gideon stopped in awe. An ancient tree rose from the stone itself. Its roots appeared to grow directly through the floor, while its branches stretched toward the high vaulted ceiling. The entire tree seemed woven from countless delicate strands of silver ash, intertwined and frozen forever in an unchanging form. At the center of its trunk, at the height of a man's chest, something small and heart-shaped pulsed with a soft golden light. The heart of the ashen tree, the artifact for which they had endured such a long and dangerous journey. "Beautiful," Gideon whispered, unable to hide his amazement. And dangerous, Morwen added, stopping him with one hand before he could move closer. According to what Helga told me, the final trial doesn't require strength or agility. It requires genuine trust between the people attempting to claim the artifact. What kind of trust? Gideon asked. Morwen pointed toward two symmetrical depressions carved into the stone floor before the tree, each roughly the size of a human palm. We have to place our hands there at the same time, she explained. The spell will test the sincerity of the bond between us through magical resonance. False trust, a partnership built on deception. The magic will recognize it and deny us access to the heart. Gideon looked at her for a long, serious moment. After last night, he said quietly, I doubt the sincerity of what exists between us will give the spell much difficulty. Morwen smiled at him, warmly, without even a trace of the defensive irony she had once used to hide everything real. Together, they lowered their palms into the carved depressions. The effect was immediate and blinding. Golden light erupted around them, spreading outward from their hands and flooding the entire chamber. The roots of the ancient tree slowly parted, opening a path toward the glowing heart. It worked, Morwen whispered, relief and triumph spreading across her face. Gideon approached the pulsing heart carefully and removed it from the embrace of the silver roots with gentle, almost reverent hands. The artifact was unexpectedly light for its size, warm to the touch, almost alive, like a beating heart enclosed inside a fragile, translucent shell. Now we go home, Gideon said, turning toward Morwen with relief and determination in equal measure. Back to Helga, back to Lyra, and to the end of this journey. The return through the sanctuary was far easier. The corridors seemed empty now, stripped of the obstacles that had challenged them before. The ancient magic appeared to have accepted their right to leave with the treasure, and offered no further resistance. But the hardest trial waiting for them was not hidden within the ruined temple. It awaited them back in the civilized world, where Grandmaster Valan and the representatives of the Order of Ash were waiting for the outcome of their mission with the same cold, calculating patience that had defined every decision the organization had made before. The artifact has been recovered, Gideon reported 2 days later, presenting the heart of the ashen tree to the Grand Master. The return journey had passed in a tense but newly intimate silence between him and Morwen. The conditions of our agreement have been fulfilled in full. Impressive, Valan said, studying the pulsing artifact with unmistakable satisfaction. Helga will be released immediately, as promised. Your sister will receive treatment as soon as she reaches the capital. And the witch? Gideon asked sharply. Tension tightened inside him as he thought of Morwen's fate, now that her part of the bargain had been completed. The agreement included her freedom in exchange for the successful completion of the mission. Velen remained silent for a long moment. His gaze moved from the artifact to Morwen, who stood behind Gideon, and his expression shifted into one of cold, calculating reconsideration. Circumstances have changed, he said at last. The Council insists that she undergo further questioning regarding the remaining secrets of the destroyed coven. We may also require her permanent presence as an advisor on matters of witch magic. That violates the terms of the agreement, Gideon said sharply, anger rising at such an open betrayal of their word. The priorities of the Order outweigh private agreements, Hunter, Velen replied with cold authority. You have fulfilled your duty by bringing her here. What happens to the witch now is no longer your concern. Standing behind him, Morwen felt as though the ground had vanished beneath her feet all over again. Another betrayal. Another promise of freedom torn away. But before she could utter a word of protest, Gideon stepped forward with a determination that surprised even him. Then I resign from the Order, he said firmly, His voice carried through the chamber with absolute certainty. The lawn froze. He had clearly not expected such an uncompromising response from one of the most disciplined and loyal hunters the Order had ever known. "Consider your words carefully, Gideon," he warned. "Leaving the Order means losing every privilege it provides, including the treatment promised to your sister." For a moment, Gideon felt the old loyalty to duty fighting against something new and far deeper. Loyalty to the woman standing beside him. But the choice was far clearer than he would have believed possible only a week earlier. "The artifact is already in your hands," Gideon said, "and the promise to help Lyra was not made to me personally. It was part of the agreement, secured by the successful completion of this mission. Break one condition of that agreement, and I will have the right to challenge the rest before the entire council, if necessary." Velen remained silent, weighing Gideon's unexpected resolve. Finally, he gave a reluctant nod, acknowledging the logic of his argument. "Very well," he said. "Your sister will receive the promised treatment, regardless of what you decide about your future service." He turned his gaze toward Morwen. "As for the witch," he studied her for a long moment. "Perhaps the best outcome for everyone involved is her complete freedom, provided she never again troubles lands under the Order's control with her presence." "I accept," Morwen said quickly, before Gideon could continue negotiating. "Helga has already been released and is waiting at the main gates," Velen added. "Take her and leave these lands before the council reconsiders its unexpected generosity." Morwen found Helga at the fortress gates only minutes later. The elderly mentor looked exhausted from imprisonment, but otherwise unharmed, and her face lit with profound joy the moment she saw her student. "Morwen, my child," she whispered, wrapping her tightly in her arms as tears of relief ran down her lined cheeks. "You're alive. Praise the goddesses. You're alive." "I nearly got myself killed saving one very stubborn hunter," Morwen said with a warm, affectionate smile. "But yes, I'm alive, Helga. And now we're both free, thanks to his rather unexpected sense of honor." Helga looked toward Gideon, who stood a short distance away with an uncertainty rarely seen in him. She studied him with the sharp perception of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning to see the true nature of people beneath their outward masks. "So you're the one," she said. "The hunter who turned against his own order to save a witch." "I only made sure justice was honored, mistress," Gideon replied, inclining his head with unusual respect. "More than justice, judging by the way you look at my girl," Helga observed with a knowing, warm smile. "Take good care of her, Hunter, or you'll discover firsthand just how dangerous an old mentor's anger can be." Unexpected heat rose to Gideon's face at the blunt remark. Morwen only laughed and took his hand with open tenderness, no longer attempting to hide what she felt. Several weeks later, Lyra had fully recovered from the curse through the power of the heart of the ashen tree, while Helga had settled into a modest but comfortable cottage on the edge of a quiet village, far from the Order's persecution. Gideon and Morwen stood together on a hill overlooking the sunset, the sky painted in soft shades of gold and crimson. "What happens now?" Morwen asked quietly, watching the sun sink beyond the distant mountain peaks. "You left the Order. Where does your road lead now, Gideon?" He remained silent for a long moment, considering his answer. Then he turned toward her with the same seriousness that had accompanied every important decision of their journey. "Wherever yours leads," he said at last, "if you'll allow me to travel beside you, Morwen. Not as a hunter escorting a prisoner, but as a man choosing freely to share your life." Morwen felt her heart stop at the openness of the offer. "You understand what that means?" she asked quietly. "A life far from everything you've known, wandering, constant caution, The possibility of being hunted again by people who still see nothing in me but a dangerous witch instead of a person. I understand, Gideon replied firmly, and I accept that future without hesitation if it means I can remain beside you. Why? She asked, though she already almost knew the answer. She could see it in the depth of his serious eyes, filled with unmistakable tenderness. Because I love you, Morwen, he said simply. There was none of the restraint that had defined so much of their journey. I think I fell in love with you long before I was willing to admit it, even to myself. Perhaps from the moment you tricked me in the Dubrovitsa marketplace and left me chasing an empty jug instead of you. I was furious, and yet I couldn't stop thinking about that reckless, untamable smile of yours. Tears of overwhelming happiness rose unexpectedly to Morwen's eyes. Her heart pounded at the sincerity of the confession she had waited so long to hear. I love you too, Gideon, she whispered. My stern, unexpectedly noble, righteous one. He drew her closer and cupped her face in his hands with the same tenderness that had shaped their first desperate kiss in the depths of the ruined sanctuary. But this kiss was different. There was no fear, no panic, only the quiet, certain joy of love finally found and returned. Trickster, he whispered between kisses, using the same word he had once spoken in wounded anger, though now it held nothing but warmth and adoration. Righteous one, she replied, with the same gentle teasing, wrapping her arms around his neck and pulling him closer. Their embrace bound their future more securely than any magical vow or oath to an order ever could. The setting sun finally disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving the sky washed in deep, velvety shades of twilight. And there, on the hilltop, stood a hunter who had abandoned his order, and a witch who had lost an entire coven, but found something no less precious in return. They held each other as they faced an uncertain future together, a future filled with love tested by hardship and freely chosen. Hand in hand, heart to heart, beyond all the old prejudices and dangers that had once separated them like an impossible chasm of hatred. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I hope this story gave you plenty of emotion and left a warm place in your heart. What would you have done if you were in Morwen's place? Would you have risked giving up nearly all your strength to save someone who had been your enemy only yesterday? Or would reason have told you to step away and protect yourself, even if it meant sacrificing another person's life? Be sure to share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. See you again soon. With love, Karina and Mia.